You think the fall of man was just a bite of fruit? A simple mistake? A slap on the wrist and a walk out of paradise? Wrong. You've been fed a watered-down fairy tale. They sanitized it. They stripped the blood, the pain, the screaming, the horror. The actual story, the full, unfiltered account, was buried. But it still exists. It's in the lost book of Adam and Eve. And it's not in your Bible. Let me make this crystal clear. This book was never meant for Sunday school. It doesn't speak in riddles. It punches you in the face. It tells you that after Adam and Eve were cast out of Eden, they didn't just leave. They collapsed. They screamed. They bled. They begged for death. And get this, they weren't thrown into a world with trees and flowers. They were dropped into a world without light. No food. No water. No clue how to survive. Adam didn't know what death was until he begged for it. Her what? She cried until her face swelled. They passed out from fear. They didn't walk out of Eden, they were ripped out. And that's how it begins. Now here's the part nobody dares to talk about. Satan wasn't done after the garden. That snake didn't slither away into the grass. He followed them. He stalked them. The Lost Book documents 11 direct attacks by Satan in the first few days alone. 11. Not whispers. Not ideas. Full-on manifestations. He appears as a beast, then a bright angel, then a man with golden hair. And each time, he's got one goal: trick Adam into killing himself. Or worse, turning against the very thing he once called Father. And it almost works. Over and over. At one point, Satan disguises himself as the voice of God. And guess what? It worked. Adam and Eve were ready to jump off a cliff. Literally. They climbed a rock, held each other, and were about to throw themselves into death because they thought it would bring them back to Eden. That's not temptation. That's psychological warfare. That's trauma weaponized. And don't think Hawa gets a pass. She's not just some passive victim. She suffers more. The book shows her collapsing multiple times, being taken over by waves of sorrow, falling into literal fits where Adam has to lift her lifeless body and scream to the heavens. This isn't romance. This is raw hell. You think you know Cain and Abel? The Sunday school version? You don't. Cain didn't just kill out of jealousy. He was in love with his own sister. Yeah. That part was ripped out from every Western Bible. The book shows that Cain and Abel were both born with twin sisters. And when it came time to divide who marries who, Cain demanded his own twin. That's not drama. That's a twisted, ancient incest war right at the root of humanity. When Adam and Eve tried to stop it, Cain grew cold. He withdrew. And you know how this ends. Abel ends up dead. But what's more disturbing is how Cain walks away from the murder with zero remorse. No regret. No guilt. He lies. He deflects. And here's the part they won't tell you: he wasn't punished immediately. He was marked and let go. Which means the first murderer in human history walked off into the wilderness, protected. Now let's get into the body count. Habel was only the first. The book makes it clear, death was everywhere. Adam and Eve lose multiple children. Some to violence. Some to disease. Some, it doesn't even say how. But they bury them. In caves. In tears. With nothing but their bare hands. Their grief isn't poetic, it's primal. They beat their chests. They tear their skin. They scream at the stars. And that's just the first generation. Every single detail of this book screams one thing: you were never told the full story. You were told a version that fits the brand. But if you read what's written here, without filters, without doctrine, without fear, then you'll realize the human story didn't begin with innocence. It began with war. A war of memory. Of obedience. of identity. Adam doesn't just suffer, he doubts. He questions. He screams at God. And not in a polite way. He says, "Why did you create me, just to throw me away?" And no, he doesn't get an answer. He gets silence. Over and over. That silence becomes a character in the story. It haunts the pages. It becomes the third presence, Adam, Eve, and the deafening silence of the Creator they thought they knew. At one point, Adam even builds an altar and offers blood, not just of animals, but his own. He cuts his skin. He pours his blood into the earth. Because he believes maybe pain is the price of returning home. That's not theology. That's desperation. This book doesn't preach. It records. It exposes. It screams. And if you think the sanitized version is all there is, you're not ready for what this book shows. So don't sit there nodding your head like you've heard it all before. You haven't. The lost book of Adam and Eve didn't just appear out of nowhere. It came into being through centuries of textual warfare. The version that survived is in Ge'ez, the liturgical language of Ethiopian Christianity, but it wasn't born in Ethiopia. Scholars agree parts of it were originally in Arabic, possibly even earlier in a Semitic tongue, an anonymous work stitched together from scattered fragments of oral tradition and local mysticism. This text is a mosaic of competing voices, an underground archive of suppressed belief. Picture monasteries in the highlands of Ethiopia, hidden among cliffs and ravines. These monks held onto chains of manuscripts others destroyed. When the dominant church authorities in the wider Christian world condemned extra books, these monks whispered and preserved. That's how this work became part of the wider Ethiopian canon. It survived where others crushed it. It becomes part of a canon that Western Christianity would never accept. Ethiopia's canon is enormous, far beyond the 66 books you know. Their tradition allowed texts the West considered heretical. That means this book was too heretical for the West to tolerate. In Western Christendom, this text was labeled apocryphal, pseudepigraphic, essentially, the Church's version of trash evidence. The gatekeepers had final say. The mainstream Church said, "We reject this." That rejection is not neutral, it's a surgical erasure. Over centuries, literal copies of this text were hunted, destroyed, or suppressed. The surviving manuscripts today are few, fragmentary, worn, with missing pages, marginal notes added by curious monks. Some are held in libraries in Ethiopia, others found in European collections, ironically brought out on the colonial trail of discovering Africa's lost faith traditions. The translation saga is brutal. Early European explorers got scraps. They saw references to the Book of Adam in Ethiopian catalogues, but they couldn't read Ge'ez. So they enlisted Arabic intermediaries. Often, parts were mistranslated, lost in cultural filter, redacted by translators with agendas. A passage describing Satan's appearance might be turned into a vague allegory to make it acceptable. One translator might erase scenes of incest, another might smooth out graphic suffering. Every version carries the scars of censorship. When you read the English version, you're reading a URL of redaction stretching back centuries. You've got to understand, this text survived not because it was safe, but because it was dangerous. Dangerous enough to be hidden. Dangerous enough to be cut out. Dangerous because it challenges control. Who gets to define the human story? The Ethiopian Church risked ostracism for holding it. Monks copied it by moonlight. They used primitive inks, parchment, iron gall ink, when they knew passing scribes or intruders would burn what they wrote. Every letter was a revolt. Then came the modern era and Western scholars showed up, brushing dust off manuscripts and saying, "Oh, look, here's something exotic." They extracted excerpts, published them, often with judgmental footnotes. They treated the text as curiosity, not revelation. Some smug scholars dismissed it as folklore. But you and I know, anything preserved under such violent suppression carries a power signal. Fragments surfaced in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, shoved into collections in Vatican archives, in royal libraries, hidden under catalogue numbers. A few Western scholars translated bits into Latin, then into German and English. But those translations often sanitized, they dropped offensive bits, rephrased, softened. Meanwhile, Ethiopian scholars began fighting, trying to reclaim their heritage, publishing editions in Ge'ez and Amharic, pointing out how Western versions were corrupt. They argued that what Westerners read is a crippled skeleton of the original beast. There's a twist. Some modern claims glibly say the entire manuscript was just found, but that's a lie by omission. No one's turned up a pristine, unedited, untouched original. What surfaced are multiple partial manuscripts, some overlapping, some contradictory. The job of today's scholarship is stitching together hellish puzzles, which piece goes where, which fragment belongs to which version, which translator inserted or removed whole sections. The text we read is a reconstruction, an academic Frankenstein. But those scars of reconstruction are part of the story. And let's bring controversy to the forefront. In Ethiopia, this book remains canonical in some circles. That gives it theological weight, legal standing in liturgical use, far more than in the West. That's why Western churches demonized it. Accepting it would demand re-evaluating foundational doctrines, sin, atonement, original human psychology. It would force mainstream traditions to admit that their sanitization process was political. And that's unacceptable to any institution built on holy authority. You as the viewer, you have to see it clearly. This isn't dusty old law. It's a battlefield of memory, power, language, and theology. The very existence of multiple redacted translations suggests active suppression. The fact that this text survived at all is a mark of resistance. The missing pages, the clipped scenes, the soft edits, those are not accidents. They are scars inflicted by centuries of censorship. Every time someone says this book is non-canonical, so ignore it, they act as gatekeepers to your perception. But what if you demand to see it, all of it, not theirs, yours? This translation war matters. The origin journey matters. The hidden trail matters. Because each lost line, each excised passage, each redaction is its own revelation of what they didn't want you to see. You want the dark engine behind this lost book unleashed, the cosmic stakes, the spiritual battlefield, the ripple effects that infect every human story since. Strap in. The conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan doesn't just tell you about a single fall, it paints the architecture of evil and how it invades every soul. It shows that human suffering, sin, and spiritual warfare aren't afterthoughts, they are baked into the human condition from day zero. The version preserved in Ge'ez, translated from an Arabic original, places heavy emphasis on interactions with demons, angels, and forces beyond human sight. This is a Christian extra-canonical work, likely compiled in Eastern tradition in the 5th to 6th century. In Book I, soon after they leave Eden, Adam and Eve confront multiple supernatural ambushes from Satan and his hosts. One moment, he attacks with a giant rock hurled from a mountain, intending to crush them beneath it. God intervenes, but the event shakes the earth, reverberating as a warning the cosmic war has just begun. Then Satan appears as an angel of light, speaking words of false hope, trying to coax them out of their sanctuary and into ruin. He stages assaults as lions, as seductive women rising from water, shape-shifting, deceptive, relentless. When Adam and Eve fast and pray in the cave, Satan returns in the 30th night and actually beats them, hoping to kill them in their exhausted, weakened state. He then masquerades in radiant garments, offering illusions of restoration. The spiritual battlefield is literal in their lives. Then you have the 40 days motif. They stay in prayer, refusing to leave the cave until God answers. But during those days, Satan launches wave after wave of attacks, apparitions, lies, assaults, tempting them to abandon their plea. On the 40th day, Satan comes in bright form, tongue-sweet, trying to trick them to exit early. Only divine intervention protects them. The book doesn't stop at spiritual attacks, it describes how their bodies change. After Eden, flesh becomes a liability, thirst, hunger, sickness, desire. Their bodies grow brutish, needing food and drink, real vulnerabilities introduced by the fall. Adam and Eve drink from a stream south of Eden only after God commands them, their physical forms adapt to the fallen world. The narrative also connects this war to the next generations. In Book 2, the descendants of Seth, the sons of God, live on a holy mountain, separated from the daughters of Cain, but they get lured down. Cainites, descendants of Cain, introduce war, musical instruments, weapons, corruption. The text claims that Seth's descendants descend, seduced, and their offspring merge with the wicked, forming Nephilim-like beings. This becomes part of the framework of moral decay, world corruption, the reason the flood happens. This text weaves the story of primordial evil and human violence together, not as a later add-on, but as inheritable, systemic. The supernatural battles aren't just flash scenes. They connect to prophetic reveals. God promises that one day humanity will be rescued. Offers are made. After the fall, God says the fruit of the tree of life will be withheld until 5,500 years pass. Until then, humanity must struggle. Also, Adam and Eve make offerings. They cut leaves, gather blood dust mixtures, create altars in their suffering, rituals born of agony, not instruction from Eden. Their offering is filled by God with light, and the Spirit descends upon it. That scene becomes a prototype, the first blood offering as a gesture toward redemption. Even the cherubim guarding Eden, the fires, the gates, the book makes these animate actors in the drama. When Adam and Eve try to return, a cherub with a flaming sword moves to kill them. The earth trembles. Invisible forces intervene. When that rock falls, God turns it into a protective shed over them, demonstrating that even in the midst of attacks, cosmic control is at play. Beyond their personal trial, this text establishes lineage warfare, Cainites versus Sethites, war-prone descendants versus sanctified ones. And the corruption is ideological, musical instruments, weapons, war, seduction, violence, all tools of satanic influence, built into human culture. Narrative asserts that from the root onward, humanity is infiltrated. This text is drenched in contradictions. The very document that claims to expand truth is riddled with internal inconsistencies and clashes with canonical scripture in ways its defenders rarely admit. The genealogies don't match. Ages of patriarchs shift. Events superimpose or contradict what Genesis states. In Conflict of Adam and Eve, Enos lives 985 years, Mahalaleel 870, Jared 989, numbers that deviate from Genesis's 905, 895, and 962 respectively. That's not poetic license. That's a broken mosaic being forced to fit into a pre-existing frame. Then there's the matter of authorship and provenance. Nobody knows who wrote this. The version as we have it is translated from Ge'ez, allegedly from an Arabic original, with ties to Syriac sources. That's a long chain of translation, rewriting, copying, and redacting, a perfect pipeline for distortions, omissions, and editorial agendas. The text itself links to Cave of Treasures and earlier Eastern legends, blurring boundaries between history and myth. The fact that it only emerges centuries after Genesis raises serious questions about its authenticity, source reliability, and motives. Critics argue it was never lost. It was never canonical. It never held weight in the West's religious institutions because it failed critical criteria, early origin, apostolic authority, doctrinal consistency. It remains extra-canonical. Mainstream scholarship labels it pseudepigraphal. That word pseudo is not a compliment. It means a false ascribed authorship. The Church wasn't afraid of this text because it was weak. It rejected it because it was dangerously misaligned with the framework it needed to maintain. The biggest red flag, the theological deviations. In the canonical tradition, the fall introduces death and corruption, but human beings retain dignity, rational soul, moral responsibility. In this book, after the fall, Adam and Eve become shadows. Their flesh becomes a burden. They lose luminosity. They become prey. It suggests that humanity's condition is more than sin-afflicted. It frames it as spiritually invaded, biologically altered. That's not just doctrine, that's mythology masquerading as revelation. Then there's the incest and lineage drama they insist on. Canonical texts avoid these tropes or treat them allegorically. This book dives into them head-on. Cain marries his own twin. The sons of Seth and daughters of Cain intermarry. The text claims that weapons, musical instruments, war, corruption originate from these primal unions. That's more than expansion, that's rewriting the origins of evil. Many criticisms focus on its lack of external attestation. There's no independent, contemporaneous source corroborating its wild claims. No archaeological evidence, no external citations in early church fathers, no early canonical references. The gospel writers don't quote it. The apostles don't reference it. That silence is deafening. It suggests this text operated on the fringes, never inside the tent of what was considered trustworthy. Moreover, its restoration efforts are suspect. Modern editions are built from fragmentary manuscripts. Editors make reconstruction choices, what to include, what to omit. You're reading a stitched-together version, not an original. Every gap is a judgment call. Every interpolated phrase might be the editor's guess. The wounds in the text are visible. Then let's talk about motive. Why would someone produce this work? It undercuts standard doctrines, original sin, salvation, human nature, revelation. It forces believers to confront more brutal, more raw versions of spiritual suffering. And that is destabilizing. The book doesn't preserve orthodoxy, it challenges it. That's why it threatens institutions. Even defenders admit the text has been sanitized in many modern versions. Graphic scenes, harsh language, scandalous claims, softened or omitted. That means what you read is a curated diet. You're tasting the broth when the recipe itself is concealed. Let's stop pretending this was all some divine arrangement of holy texts falling magically into place. The clean, bite-sized Bible you know today is the result of centuries of political negotiations, doctrinal infighting, imperial consolidation, and editorial assassination. The fact that this book of Adam and Eve didn't make the cut wasn't some innocent oversight, it was intentional filtration. This wasn't God closing a canon. This was men in robes and thrones locking the gates. Take the Council of Carthage in 397 AD. That's one of the milestones where books were officially in or out. But the people voting weren't prophets. They were bureaucrats. They were bishops under political pressure from emperors who wanted a stable empire, not a fractured mess of competing gospels, visions, dreams, and claims. So, texts that challenged orthodoxy, gone. Books that didn't line up with Rome's theology? Gone. Accounts that made the chosen apostles look weak, human, divided? Gone. The so-called conflict of Adam and Eve didn't get lost, it got dropped. And the reason is brutal, it didn't fit the tone. The book is chaotic. It's emotional. It's too raw, too disturbing, too uncomfortable. The church wasn't interested in a God who allows his first creation to spiral into trauma and torment. They didn't want to hand believers a version of humanity where demons stage attacks on day one and where God answers with silence. Let's look at how the surviving versions are treated. Academic publishers categorize it as apocryphal, like it's some cute bedtime fable. That's deliberate. It softens the threat. Nobody wants to admit that this book contains narratives older than some of the canon material or that it shares themes with other banned texts like the Book of Enoch. Grouping them under the pseudepigrapha label is a passive-aggressive way of putting a warning sign around them, read this, but don't take it seriously. It's control, not scholarship. But here's the kicker, while the West buried it, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept it. That alone should raise red flags. Ethiopia didn't inherit its Bible from Rome. It wasn't forced through Constantinople. It's one of the oldest Christian traditions on earth, tracing its roots to the 4th century, and it kept books the West torched, including this one. So you've got to ask, if a tradition that old, that independent, held onto this text, why are we pretending it has no value? Because admitting it has value means admitting the canon isn't perfect. That there were other perspectives. That truth might have come with more blood, more fear, and more horror than the tidy version most churches prefer to sell. And don't get distracted by the YouTube grifters flashing found. ancient lost book in 144 points font. That's not the problem. The real issue is that those same sensational headlines pull attention away from the deeper problem. Western theology is built on selective memory. The Book of Adam and Eve isn't dangerous because of its content, it's dangerous because it was rejected. Rejected by a system that wanted order, not honesty. Uniformity, not humanity. Now let's be clear. No, this book wasn't written by Adam himself. Yes, it contains editorial layers, cultural input, inconsistencies, all of it. But so does every ancient text, including the ones we now call canonical. What made the difference wasn't truth. It was vote counts. It was doctrinal alignment. It was whose theology paid the bills. When Rome backed a version of Christianity, it needed a clean origin story. A fall, a curse, a promise of redemption, but all structured like a neat three-act play. This book didn't play along. It introduced confusion. It portrayed a God that was distant and a Satan that was active. It made spiritual war look like real war, relentless, unpredictable, and terrifying. So it was cut. Or, more accurately, buried. Relegated to eastern vaults and obscure manuscripts. Left to rot until some 18th century scholar stumbled across it and treated it like a freak show. That's the pattern. Suppress first. Ridicule second. Control third. The sad part? Most people will never read the actual content. They'll see the headline, hear the label non-canonical, and walk away. That's how deep the conditioning goes. That's how successful the purge was. So next time someone says, that book doesn't count, remember, that's not a theological position. That's a legacy of censorship. The real threat wasn't what the book said. The real threat was that it said too much. Listen, this lost book of Adam and Eve, a conflict with Satan, doesn't just end with cave walls and torment. It spills over into human history, prophecy, legacy, and even touches the threads that go forward, all while remaining hidden, distorted, weaponized. The book claims to chart the journey from the first expulsion all the way through the generations, linking the origin story to the great catastrophes, the rise of corruption, and the eventual hope of restoration. After the trials in the cave, Adam and Eve go on. They wander, migrate, and attempt to make a life. They settle in the Cave of Treasures, but even there, attacks continue. At one point, Eve is alone, laboring under childbirth, in pain and fear, while Adam struggles to find aid. The book narrates that Michael and other angels assist, that Adam had to fast and pray for deliverance, and that in his sickness he foresaw future judgment, the coming of a Redeemer, and even the resurrection. The text frames Adam's death not as a quiet sleep but as a scene with cosmic tremors, angels in attendance, and a chariot of light carrying his body heavenward. Meanwhile, Eve dies soon after, buried near him. Their burial spot is tied to the same soil from which Adam was made, poetic, but told as literal fact. It doesn't stop with their deaths. The text gives genealogies up to Noah, even to Jesus, inserting the names of wives, rare detail you don't see normally. It also weaves in more legends. The sons of God are identified as Seth's descendants, the daughters of men come from Cain's line, and the text claims the Cainites actively seduce and corrupt the Sethites. From that union, terrible lineages are born: Nephilim, war, bloodshed, music, weapons, instruments, societal collapse. The book positions Satan's influence not as distant whisper but as the architect behind cultural instruments, war, tools, arts, things you and I take as neutral or even good, painted as twisted extensions of primordial corruption. One of the more shocking episodes, Satan is punished, made mute and cast to India. The serpent is said to lose speech and is exiled. But later he returns in disguise, in radiant garments, tricking Adam and Eve repeatedly. The book describes multiple apparitions, Satan appearing dozens of times. In one chapter, he offers rest, comfort, restoration as bait. In another, armed rocks are hurled. He battles. He tempts. He mimics divine voices. He feigns angels of light. Face-to-face warfare in flesh. The text also includes prophetic declarations. It promises that after 5,500 years, the Tree of Life fruit will again be accessed. It offers epochs, timelines, and prophetic echoes of Noah's flood. It refers to the Great Flood as a purification, one that reboots corruption. It implies that the world as it now is, with all its cruelty, is still part of that original trauma unleashed in Eden. The narrative says, the flood was not random, it was predictable, necessary, an extension of the conflict that started in the cave. Now let me turn directly to you, because in all this cosmic lore, you as the viewer are part of the equation. You live in the aftermath. The book claims that the primordial warfare still lives in you, your temptations, suffering, cultural decay, violence, moral collapse, they are echoes, ripples, fragments of that first battle. It's not escapism. It's mapping. It's claiming there is a through line from that raw war in the cave to every act of betrayal, every scream, every battlefield, every corrupt institution. And here's a twist, despite all the power in the narrative, the lost book remains suppressed. It's hidden in Ethiopia. It exists in manuscripts scattered abroad. Modern translations are partial, censored, reconstructed. The full force of the narrative doesn't appear in most versions. But the bones of it are powerful. And the book claims that God Himself preserved it, hidden until a time when someone would open the gates of memory and let people see the original fracture in creation. Thank you, truly, for staying with me until the end. I mean that. Appreciate you watching this all the way through.